Welcome to week 3, Morse Code to 4G. This week the radio arrives and the telephone continues. So continuing with our telephone conversation, as many technological advances occur, telephone begins to catch on and each feed each other. In 1892, a fellow by the name of Amon Stowager developed the dial telephone system. Interesting story, he was an undertaker, and he was upset when he found out that the telephone operator in town, who happened to be the wife of his competitor, was routing calls for him over to her husband. Well, being a smart fellow, he actually figured out how to create what we call the dial telephone system and to get the operator out of the loop so that you could actually call direct numbers from your phone. Created a company called Automatic Electric, and it manufactured what we call step-by-step central office equipment. First automatic CO was installed in LaPorte, Indiana. Pretty clever, and he made a lot of money. In 1900, a guy by the name of John Carty, he was the chief engineer of New York Telephone, installed loading coils, which were invented by a guy named Michael Pupin. Now, a loading coil, make a long story short, eliminates crosstalk, allowed you to actually do crossover or transposition of your wires, which then reduced crosstalk. We won't get into all of the technical details behind this, but some of us who are old enough to remember making phone calls, and you could actually hear other conversations in the background sometimes. That was called crosstalk, and this loading coil helped you use technology to reduce that and sometimes eliminate. In 1914, the underground cables were installed between Boston, New York, and Washington, D.C. And in 1915, this is a huge milestone, a vacuum tube amplifier, there were several installed, to create the first coast-to-coast telecoast circuit. On opening day, they had Mr. Bell sitting in New York City, they had Mr. Watson in San Francisco, and Bell repeated his most famous sentence to his assistant, "Mr. Watson, come here, I want you," to which Watson replied, "If you want me, it will take me almost a week to get there." This is huge. We just had a voice conversation across the entire United States, real time, instantaneously, speed of light, speed of electricity. This has never happened before. Yes, we've had telegraph, but not voice. And the concept, the revolutionary concept, was absolutely huge. Around this time, a guy by the name of E.T. Whittaker developed a sampling theorem, or mathematical formula, that was used to form the basis of what we use today in PCM and TCM technology. Okay, what is PCM, TCM? Pulse code modulation and time-coded modulation. We'll talk more about this in later weeks, but why is this important? This is the basis of digital telephones, digital radio, the basis of a huge revolution that began to occur in the latter half of the 20th century. Meantime, on the wireless front, radio. It was developing at the same time as the landline. So, who discovered all of this? Heinrich Hertz, known as the father of radio, if you will, he was the first one to develop the concept of that you could transmit and receive electrical waves wirelessly. He was the first one to prove it, and is recognized as one of the fundamental building blocks of radio. Every frequency measurement is named after him, the hertz. If you look at your car radio dial and you're listening to 98.3 FM on your dial, that's 98.3 megahertz. Or 1100 AM would be 1.1 megahertz. That's just in case you didn't know what that MHz stood for. Also around this time, Nikola Tesla, a brilliant man from Serbia, discovered the basis for most alternating current machines, as they called them. Came to the U.S. in 1884 and then sold his patents off to a guy named George Westinghouse. Westinghouse, brilliant man, went on to prove that AC was far superior to DC for home electrical use, in huge battles between he and Thomas Edison on electrical distribution grids and networks. Bottom line is Westinghouse won this, the popularity contest, if you will, and that's the reason why we have AC in our houses, and all of our electrical devices run on AC for the most part in the home and business. Anyway, Tesla took the money that he got from Westinghouse and built a lab where he invented many things, including the Tesla coil, which is one of them was used widely in radios back then. Ernst Alexanderson, he was from Sweden, invented the first alternator, not the kind that you use in a car, but an alternator that allowed the transmission of speech on radio, unlike dots and dashes. Brilliant man. held 344 patents and virtually invented everything that GE did in AM and FM and television up to during his time there with GE. And Reginald Fessenden rather, he spent most of his time in U.S., where he developed a number of ways to combine sound and radio waves as mixed signals. And in 1906, using the alternator developed by Ernst, he made the first long-range transmission of voice by radio from Brant Rock, Massachusetts. Again, huge breakthrough at this point. Marconi, my goodness, from Italy, living most of his life in England, developed many of the firsts in wireless telegraphy or wireless Morse code that was used by the European navies. The Titanic disaster, as bad as it was could have been far worse if they had not had a radio and a radio operator on board who was able to, via Morse code, transmit the location and allowed other ships to come to rescue the 700 people who did survive. And Lee DeForest, considered to be the father of American radio, he was in direct competition with Marconi around that time. Chief scientist with the American Wireless Telephone and Telegraph until Marconi bought the company. Anyway, his greatest contribution is the 1906 Audiotron vacuum tube. This is the end of part 1 of our lecture. It will continue in part 2 on your blackboard.